There are times you would want to see things from a user's perspective, most especially when offering support for issues they might be having. In those scenarios, it will be helpful to be able to log in as the users so as to experience the issues firsthand. So in this lesson, I will be showing you how to implement user impersonation in AdonisJS. Here, I have a very basic AdonisJS application that displays a list of users in the database with an option to impersonate each user. You'll notice this last user, that is John Doe, doesn't have the impersonate button. That is because John Doe here is the admin, and since John Doe is the one logged in, there is no point impersonating himself. Now let's take a look at the code. To keep things simple and straightforward, we are going to implement everything directly inside the route file. For now, I have 3 routes. The first one is the home route, which serves the home page. I am fetching all users from the database and passing it to the welcome view to be rendered. Then I have another route for logging in. I just manually log in the admin user, which is the user with the ID of 1. Then I redirect back to the home page. Then lastly, a logout route, which logs out the admin. Let's go to the welcome view. So I check if the user is logged in and is an admin. Then I display a list of the users. Then a way to impersonate if the user is not the admin user. Then also a way to log out. Then lastly, if the user is not logged in, we have a link for the user to log in. So now let's start implementing user impersonation. I'll be showing you 2 ways to impersonate users in AdonisJS. The first method is to log the user we are trying to impersonate in using the login via ID method. Then the second method is to simply overwrite the user property on the auth object. So let's start with the first one. First, we need a way to get the ID of the user we want to impersonate. So let's make this a form. This will submit to say/impersonate. Let's add the CSRF token field. Then we are going to have an hidden input field, which will hold the ID of the user we want to impersonate. We can give this a name of impersonated ID. Then the value will be the ID of the user, that is user.id. Next, let's create this route. This is going to be a post route. Let's pull in auth. Then we can do await auth.login via ID. Then we'll pass in the ID of the user we want to impersonate, which we can get from the request. Let's pull in request. Then request.input. Then the name is impersonated ID. Then we can redirect to the home page. Of course, we need to pull in response. Of course, now the impersonated user would be logged in, but we will have an issue with this because there is no way to stop impersonation and log back as the admin user. To fix that, we need a way to store the ID of the admin user, that is the impersonator. So when it is time to stop impersonating the user, so we can simply retrieve the impersonator's ID and log them in. For that, we are going to make use of session. So let's pull in session. Then before we log the impersonated user in, we're going to save the impersonator's ID in the session. So session.put, we're going to give it a key of impersonator ID. Then the value will be auth.user.id. Now we're able to log in the user we want to impersonate and also store the ID of the impersonator, which we can retrieve later on to exit the impersonation mode and log back in as the admin user. Let's head over to the browser and test this. So I'm going to impersonate Tommy. We should now be logged in as Tommy. And because Tommy is not an admin user, that is where we are seeing the login link. Let's update the welcome view. So instead of displaying the list of users for only admin, we are going to tweak it a bit and display it for all users. So now we are going to display the form to impersonate a user if the user is an admin. And the authenticated user is not the user we are trying to impersonate. Now if we head back and refresh, we should see the list of users without the form to impersonate any user because the user that is logged in, that is Tommy, is not an admin. Now let's add a way to show that we are impersonating a user. Remember we saved the impersonator's ID in the session. So now we are going to check if the impersonator ID is in the session. That way we know that, oh, we are actually impersonating someone. So if session.asImpersonator ID, Then we can display a message that says you are currently impersonating auth.user.name. Let's head over to the browser and check this. Now we can easily see that we are impersonating someone so as not to get carried away in the impersonation mode. Next, let's add a way to stop the impersonation. So we're going to have a form here. Let me copy this. The action can be /impersonate/stop. Of course, this can be anything depending on the convention you are using to name your routes. Here we don't need the impersonated ID. And this can be stop impersonating. Now let's create the route. Again, it's going to be a post route. And this will be /impersonate/stop. And all we have to do to stop the impersonation is to fetch the impersonator's ID from the session and log him or her in. Again, using the login via ID method. Let's get auth as well as session. Then await auth.login via ID. From the session, we'll get the impersonator's ID. Session.pool. The key was impersonator ID. Then finally, we can redirect back to the home page. Let's head over to the browser and test this out. So now we've stopped impersonating Tommy and we are logged in back as the admin. So that is one way to implement user impersonation in AdonisJS. Now let's take a look at the second way. The second way doesn't involve totally logging out the impersonator. We will simply just update the user property on the auth object to that of the impersonated user, which will basically kind of log them in. Since we get the authenticated user using the user's property on the auth object, let's see how to implement that. Instead of storing the authenticated user ID in the session, we are going to store the ID of the user we want to impersonate inside the session. So I'm going to grab this and paste it here. So we are storing the ID of the user we want to impersonate inside the session, and let's rename this to be appropriate. So this is going to be impersonated ID. We can get rid of this. Next, let's create a middleware that will check if the session has the impersonated ID and fetch the user with the impersonated ID and update the user property on the auth object. Is make middleware. I'm going to call it impersonate. Next, I'm going to register it as a named middleware. The name is going to be impersonate. And let's pull in auth and session. Then we have an if check that will check if the session has the key impersonated ID. If it does, we will fetch the user using the impersonated user's ID. Await user. User has been imported at the top. .find. Then we'll get the user ID from the session. Session.get. And the key is impersonated ID. Let's save this in a variable. Impersonated user. Now we can overwrite the user property on the auth object using the impersonated user. So auth.user equals impersonated user. Now we can make use of the middleware. We are going to apply it to the home route. Let's head over to the browser and refresh. Now let's try impersonating this user. And of course, we are getting an error. Cannot set property user of auth, which has only one getter. The impersonate middleware is the one throwing up. Let's head over there. So this should be auth.use, the guide we are using, which is web, and .user. Let's head back and refresh. Now we are currently logged in as Tommy, but there's no way to see that. So we need to update the welcome view once more. Now this is impersonated ID. So next, let's implement stopping the impersonation. All we have to do is get rid of the impersonated ID from the session, and we can do that using session.forget. Now let's try stopping the impersonation, and of course we are back as the admin. So there we have it, how to implement user impersonation in AdonisJS. In this lesson, we looked at 2 ways to implement user impersonation. Depending on the one that is more appealing to you, you can decide to use any of them. I personally prefer the second method since it doesn't involve actually logging out the admin user. Also, it is worth mentioning that I got to know about the second method from Aman, the creator of AdonisJS.